me because I was thinking, oh, I'm looking at that one and that one and that person who's all reflecting back to me my same mood. I watched a movie this week, and the guy falls in love, and on his way to work the next day, he's so happy, he's skipping along, and people join him in dancing, and the bird lands on his finger, and it's like the inner life and the outer life reflect back. That's an important thing to think about for us, because we're in a place and a space where I think the whole world is pretty stressed out. A lot of people are feeling the fatigue and the discouragement, the hopelessness and the helplessness of lots of things that are outside of us, but then are going inside and gnawing and hurting our spirits. There's a lot of reasons for that, and you know them as well as I do. And just for one, it's February, right? And the weather, my goodness. So it's hard not to feel the oppression of that. And then we're coming up on Lent, and we're going to have these 40 days of preparation for Jesus' death, of remembering what that meant, and it's pretty bleak. Some of our service, the first week of March, we're going to be doing Ash Wednesday, where we come slam head on into the reality of our own mortality, as if we haven't been doing that enough already. And so we're in a place where it seems to me resurrection is absolutely fundamental, foundational for our hope. And guess what? It always is. It's not like this is anything new, but sometimes we forget. Sometimes we forget to hold on to the power of that, even though it is hidden in plain sight. So I want to name for you some of my favorite things that remind me of resurrection, to think about with you what this resurrection means. The concept, of course, of resurrection is embedded in creation. Yes, it has been a crummy weather week, but you have probably noticed, as I have, that certain things are starting to come up from the ground. These hopes of spring, of new life in the midst of winter. Hibernating animals whose lives who don't eat for months, and then suddenly they come back to full force, and even with babies. The seasons remind us, the deciduous trees, the tides that grow back and forth, the moon that waxes and wanes, all of these things of creation remind us it might look bleak right now, but that time is going to change and something new is waiting to be born. During the intertestamental period, the time right before Jesus, about 200 years, and Jesus was born into this time, there was this burgeoning of ideas about what resurrection meant. There was this back and forth, and part of that was because it was a really bleak time, especially in Palestine. There were these transitions, these different oppressing groups that came in and crushed them, and life was really difficult. And there was a need for hope. There was a need to say, yeah, it's bad now, but it's going to get better. And in all of that, the idea of life after death became much more acute and important than it had been. And so there were about 14 different rabbinical groups, schools of thought, that had opinions about the resurrection, about life after death for people. And we hear it in the New Testament with Jesus and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, because one group didn't believe in resurrection and the other one did. But there were a whole bunch of different positions, and all of them were about how can we have hope in the midst of this evil time? How can we believe in a loving God when good people die and they didn't deserve it? How do we walk through that? And resurrection was a way of saying, okay, a 5-year-old child died. There is no hope in that. But there is a life for that child beyond death. And there's definitely consolation in that and in that conversation. We hear these conversations and ideas about resurrection even in our text that you heard, right? Jesus has one way of talking about it. I go to prepare a place for you. And his resurrection, which we'll focus on next time, really speaks to some of this difference of understanding what resurrection looks like. But Paul, in our conversation this morning really holds it up as this transition, as a seed, that our lives are like seeds, and at some point after burial, after we're under the ground, then there is something that grows that is so transformative and meaningful and powerful that this life is just a fraction, just a fragment of what is held up there in that future of eternity. Weakness will become powerful. Seeds will become massively more than we could ask or imagine. That's resurrection hope. That's the transformation that we experience when we look at Jesus and we say, he was Jesus, this peasant. He died. He is the Christ that we envision on our icon, the Christ that stands in the cosmos of the universe, all of which speaks to resurrection. For me, and I don't know if this has been your experience, but resurrection has always felt like it was sort of this, this is probably a terrible metaphor, but like a locker in the locker room. In other words, it was this like meaning package that was sort of enclosed. It wasn't broad. It wasn't wide enough. I saw it as sort of narrow in the categories of just Christianity, and narrow in the categories of it's a body and it rises again. But when we look at the scriptures, it's not just our bodies. It is the whole world that is moving towards resurrection. The whole world that is currently showing us the nature of God, who is and was and always will be, that it's always been about resurrection. It's always been about that, about new life, of the rising up of that which did not have life before. Ezekiel, that we heard, the dry bones. Can these dry bones live again? You know, Lord. Can our dry bones live again? You know, Lord, they can. In the midst of the deepest hopelessness we experience, we know that God has a plan and a hope and the power to renew and reinvigorate, to revitalize that which looks like it will expire. That is our hope today. So my question for you is, where is resurrection in your life? Where is it in plain sight? So that when you walk out of this place, you can remind yourself, when you're like me and you start looking at the stuff you shouldn't be looking at because it's so discouraging, like the news, but those places where you can get yourself down, where are you going to look and find resurrection? This is one of those talk-back sermons, so if anybody just had one pop in their mind, tell me about it. Where do you see resurrection in your life? Anybody got one?
I see it when I read Jesus Calling, my devotional every day.
So, sorry to interrupt you.
Just that I get, my spirit gets resurrected every day in the sense that I know God's there, and it just changes my life.
Yeah. So Karen's talking about reading a devotional that speaks to her in her spirit from God and reminds her and gives her that hope and resurrection. Yeah. Somebody else? Yes, Paul. The rising of the sun every day. Yep. So valuable as a symbol for us, right? Of that hope that in the darkness light will rise. Anybody else? Yeah. Laura.
I think of two things. I pay a lot of attention to the birds in the backyard in the summer as well as the winter, and it's fascinating. And I say out loud in the morning that I'm going to experience joy today. I think it's a resurrection for me.
Absolutely. So looking at the birds and seeing their life and the marvel sometimes, especially when it's been so cold, how they survive in the midst of that. And then, I will have joy today. I will receive joy today. The word spoken in faith. Yeah. One of my favorites, and you probably have heard this before, is woolly bear caterpillars. You know, those little ones that are like, they're orange and brown, and at different years, they're like more brown or more orange. These little dudes are incredible. So I saw this on Nature, and whenever I see a woolly bear caterpillar, I stop to give God thanks in adoration for these tiny little caterpillars. Because did you know, in the Arctic these things live, and it gets so cold, and even here, when it is so cold, these caterpillars have to go through a certain level of seasons before they can get to the right weight to become moths. And so in that process, it gets so cold that they die. They literally have no life function. They go under a rock, they curl up, they are dead. And in the spring, they come back to life. It is a marvel. They have some kind of antifreeze in their bodies that keeps them from having their cells just explode like everything else that freezes. You know, it creates huge damage. And then they live for 24 hours once they become moths. But in that process, like the marvel of God, to put that in the little genes of a little caterpillar. These are the things that to hold on to, my friends. And not just for yourself, but because when we walk out into the world as hope bearers, at times like these, we are powerful for Christ. We are hope bearers. We are the shining light that will remind people that in the midst of this, in spite of all that's happened in our lives, God is still good and faithful, and resurrection is there, and we believe it. We believe it just like those early disciples believed it, enough to die for it, enough to live for it, enough to preach it and speak it and love people in the midst of their despair. That's who we're called for. We are called to be resurrection people. That's what the church is all about. This is it. God so loved the world that he died and lived and walked among us and gives us hope. So much that the whole world is created with the echoes and the revelation of the nature of a God who says, you may be dry bones, but you will live. This season may feel like it's lasting forever, but a new season is coming. This world may despair and decay and die, but behold, there will be a new world. A new heaven and a new earth is promised in Revelation. Let's love the one we're in. Let's not despair about the future. That's our call as resurrection people. Here's an example of what it looks like when we are people who live in that hope. My grandmother, Dorothy Mackenzie, was in a plane crash way back in the day when airplanes were just kind of commercial airlines were really new, and she was flying in northern Canada and was in a plane crash. They landed in a lake and she saved someone from drowning. I wish I had met her. She must have been an amazing woman. But my mom told me that after that, she had the plane crash before she had kids. When my mom was 6 or 7, they would fly over northern Canada. And one time they were in this airplane and they went into this terrible, terrible thunderstorm. And that plane was this is before you could get up to 35,000 feet. So they were shaking and jolting and the lightning was all around them. And my mom said she just kept looking at her mother because her mother knew. Her mother had hope. And her mom was calm as a cucumber. She didn't get upset. She wasn't anxious. And so my mom didn't get anxious because she knew who knew. And that person, my grandmother, knew they were going to make it. That's us, friends. We are the people on the plane in the turbulence who know that we're going to make it, that God's got us. There is nothing to fear. What can separate us from the love of God? Not death, not life, not principalities and powers. We've got this. Let's trust, let's believe, and let's continue to walk in love together, believing in the power of resurrection.